It is time for another episode of Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. Welcome to another edition of Food Farm Talk, where we celebrate food and honor those who champion the cause of food in society. Welcome to another episode of Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. I am your regular host, Abdul. The program is also hosted by Emily Duncan and Paul Smith. Today, I'm going to take us through a few headlines that have made waves within the month of May in the Canadian agricultural landscape. As we all know, we are still within some kind of restrictions with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do know that most of the headlines within the month have some kind of connection to the lockdown and its implications for agriculture industry. But what I want to really do today is actually to dedicate this episode to talk more about the effects of the pandemic regards to what we are seeing in the news, mostly from the producer side, not entirely through the entire food supply chain. So we are going to focus on the farms here and what the pandemic is actually doing to the farms and what the headlines are saying about some of these things. So let's get started. But before we dive into our main part, I just want to take this as an opportunity to thank all people, the front lines that are helping us survive through these unprecedented times, and more especially people who are making sure that we have food on our tables, in our plates to be able to eat. So a special thank you go to our farmers who are still, despite all these challenges, tilling the field, tilling the land, raising the animals, and trying to make sure that there's still enough food to sustain us within these times. And of course, another shout out goes out to all people working in grocery stores, people working in the entire food supply chain. They have been and doing an amazing job, and we really take this as an opportunity to thank them. So that being said, let's get started and let's see what we have. I think to start with, I'm going to start with this important story that's not really from a news article, but that was in the early part of May. As we do know, as the pandemic was actually wrecking through all sectors, the Canadian government made a lot of efforts in terms of helping different sectors with different kind of support systems that they needed. So in the early part of May, it was finally time for farmers to also get their share of the government support. And I think that was on the 5th of May. There's this article that was run by the Financial Post. I'm just going to read a short excerpts from it. It said that the federal government moved on Tuesday to ease multiple pressures in Canada's agriculture industry by creating the COVID-19 pandemic with a promise of about 252 million aid package. Generally, we were told that the funds fell short of 2.6 billion requests for help that, in fact, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture actually sent out to the Prime Minister. The article goes further to say that we know that farmers still have concerns about what the pandemic means for their industry in the long term, and this was a direct statement from Justin Trudeau. So, as I mentioned, in the early part of May, this aid package came, and farmers, as a kind of support to the agriculture industry, mostly for farmers, in order to help them. So, within this entire package, we had about 77 million was allocated to helping farmers deal with the shortage of labor and then getting the labor into the field as well. We also had about 125 million out of the total being allocated to issues around getting farmers to go into the field and helping farmers to also keep animals on the farms for much longer due to the disruptions in slaughter processes and in processing. And of course, we also had about I think about 50 million was actually allocated to buy surplus food from the agriculture sector, as we know that disruptions meant that farmers will still have some surplus food. So the prime minister actually described this as just an initial investment, like an initial support. There could be more to come, because we also do know that despite all this, it actually fell short of what the farmers asked for. So there were a lot of criticisms about this aid package, as there's an article that was run in, I think that's by Glacier Farm Media. It's a Canadian cattleman. So in that article, Michelle Dagley, who is the chair of the National Cattle Feeders Association, actually was quoted directly saying that in fact the 50 million is not significant enough to have an impact on the backlog that their sector is actually facing, in terms of the fact that the disruptions in the supply chain meant that farmers need to keep animals on their farms for much longer, and then feeding them will come at a cost. So generally, as I mentioned, this beef industry or the cattle sector actually said that, so from the beef industry viewpoint, it falls quite a bit short of what we need to maintain a thriving industry. Canadian Cattlemen's Association President Bob Lowe said he actually added that 50 million for set aside is definitely needed, is there, but unfortunately we used it up a number of weeks ago. So which meant that by the time the money had come, at least from the perspective of cattle farmers, that money was already used. So yes, we do know that there were efforts by the government to actually support the agriculture industry, but as we heard from some of the articles, we were told that some of the support fell short. And generally, looking at the kind of impact the COVID-19 pandemic has actually had on Canadian agriculture, even from my personal experience, we do know that the government could have done more, and we still do expect that the government will probably do more going forward, because the agriculture sector need more support, especially with the disruption of their labor, and then more cost in terms of housing the labor, and then new safety measures on farms. There's just a lot. And that being said, we know that most Canadian farmers, including the animal sector and as well as the crop sector, had a very hard year last time with regards to weather, of course, and then with regards to issues that we had with China as well, which meant that most farmers had to keep their crops on the field for much longer. So some of these things issues have just been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's see what will happen going forward. But moving away from this issue, we do also know that another important issue that farmers are actually facing, the producer side, was actually the issue of labor. We've talked about labor a lot of times on this show, and it keeps coming up all the time. We do know that the Canadian agriculture sector already faces a massive gap, and an article by the Canadian Agriculture Human Resource Council already projected that by 2029, at least 1 in 3 jobs in agriculture will go unfilled. This is troubling. But we need to look at the situation now, and we do know that what is happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadian farmers were expecting temporary foreign workers, which were disrupted by this pandemic. So which means that farmers need to look out for more local-based labor, and all those adjustments meant that it's a big challenge. So there's this article. I'm just going to dive a little bit into the article that is run by, again, the Western Producer. That was on the 22nd of May. And it says, Horticulture Council of Canada continue to warn of labor shortages. So the Horticulture Council of Canada says that federal government is using inaccurate numbers to describe how many temporary foreign workers are in the country. So during May 9 virtual meeting by the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, Council President Brian Gilroy said food security continued to be threatened as a result of labor shortages exacerbated by COVID-19, like I mentioned earlier. So, but he did add that the government has been using statistics in its briefings that do not reflect the situation on the ground. And this is mostly like, it's a common issue with trying to link policy to practice in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. And from this comment, we are seeing that kind of disconnection. So he actually elaborated on it, and which is captured in the article as well. Government officials, including the Agriculture Minister, Marie-Claude Bibao, have reported in recent weeks that compared to last year, 86% of temporary workers arrived in March. The government has also reported 10,066 workers arrived in April. But Gilroy said that in Ontario, about 78% of workers have arrived this year compared to last year, while only 50% have arrived in Quebec and 54% in British Columbia. So they continue to warn that this is a very treacherous situation. And just as we are recording this, I think just a few days ago, the government actually created close to about 4,000 more jobs in agriculture, expecting that students and other young people in Canada will actually take advantage of these jobs in order to gain experiences in the agriculture sector. So it's a bit troubling. We already know that this is an issue in the agriculture sector, but the COVID-19 pandemic has actually made this thing worse, and we have to find ways to actually deal with this if we are going to be successful. But that being said, we know it's a big challenge. We need to continue to work towards solutions within COVID-19. And I know what I personally think from my perspective is that going forward, this gives us an opportunity to actually sit down and reflect on what has been happening in the industry, and to use the COVID-19, I would say that it is giving us like a level playground to build up from. So we need to get things right. And to get things right, we need to work towards understanding what is actually happening on the ground, so that our policies will be tailored towards addressing those things, rather than having that kind of disconnect between policy and practice. So that was another issue that has actually ravaged the sector. So I'm going to touch on one more issue before I move to the next section of this episode, and that has been anxiety over meat sector. We do know that the meat sector has been devastated by this pandemic. First of all, we've had issues about farmers because of keeping animals for longer. People had to euthanize animals in order, since there were no meat processing plants to actually process what they had. So that's a big issue as well. And I do have an issue here, an article here that is iPolitics. It's an agriculture producer consider euthanization as COVID-19 restricts access to plants. So farmers groups are warning, and that was like prior to what is happening, because we do know that in later parts of the pandemic, some farmers went ahead with these processes as well, and we had backlash, but they also had their own reasons as well. So that's a big issue. It's a very big issue. But just to touch on that aspect, we do know that most of the plants, meat processing plants, the largest which is in Alberta, got shut down because of COVID-19 outbreak, and the meat processing plants have been some of the hotspots in the last couple of weeks of COVID-19 outbreak. So this brought a lot of disruption to the system, which means that farmers need to adapt, which means that some practices might not be as desirable as we wish, but they still had to go through some of these processes in order to survive. That's a very big challenge for the industry. But we do know that all is not gloom. Even within all these challenges, farmers have been forcing to feed us. They are thriving. And like I mentioned earlier, we need to thank them. So I'm just going to use this opportunity to play a song to thank the farmers, and then I'll come back to look at some of the bright spots that we may see with regards to COVID-19, building on my earlier point that this might be an opportunity for us to get things right. So enjoy this song titled Thank a Farmer.
Your truck to the coffee in your cup. Don't thank the corner store or that early morning rush. thank a farmer. Yeah, I think back to that hayfield filled with girls and four wheels, sneaking off with her for that first time. You can thank a farmer. I still believe in amber waves of grain, man on his knees praying for rain that grew this country strong and keep us moving on. They get tougher as their lives keep getting harder. Oh, I think it's time we all thank a farmer. From the blacktop roads you ran that used to be his land, to big cities and small towns that he built with his two hands, you can thank a farmer. And for this shirt on my back and these boots on my feet and them tank top wearing country girls and them old skin tight blue jeans, I thank a farmer. Yeah, I thank a farmer. I still believe in amber waves of grain, man on his knees praying for rain that grew this country strong and keep us moving on. They get tougher as their lives keep getting harder. Yeah, I think it's time we all thank the farmer. I still believe in amber waves of grain, man on his knees praying for rain that grew this country strong and keep us moving on. They get tougher as their lives keep getting harder. I think it's time we all thank a farmer. Thank a farmer. A lot of folks like me still care about the FFA and county fairs and the folks who really make this world go round. I'd like to thank a farmer.
Okay, welcome back again. So, like I mentioned, in this second part, we are going to talk about some of the bright spots that we may be seeing, building on my earlier point. But before I do that, I came across this article too that was from the Western Producer, the 21st of May, and it reads that COVID hurdles identified. So it talks about a report that was released in April that identifies some of the challenges of COVID-19. So it just summarizes some of the things that I was talking about, and it has this future outlook to it as to what we should do. So I'm just going to read a few lines from that article, and then I'll move forward to talk about what we may be taking out from this pandemic as well. So the article reads, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute has identified short and long-term issues affecting the food system's resilience. In a report resulting from discussion with 40 stakeholders, the Ottawa-based think tank said the supply chain is performing well, but uncertainty prevails. We do all know that, yes. Grocery stores have managed to still feed people, of course, with the support of local-based food systems as well. But of course, we've had some few shortages. We've seen meat prices rising. So there has been some few uncertainties and challenges. So many challenges currently facing the industry, according to the report, were related to logistics. Supply does not rate as high concern, but getting that supply transported, distributed, and stocked on retail shelves does. The report noted absenteeism of workers is up to 10% at input supplies, plants, warehouses, retailers, and there's concerned workers at ports, including inspectors, will get sick, creating a backlog of imported ingredients or products needed to keep the supply chain efficient. Of course, this ties back to the earlier issue we were talking about with regards to the labor. So even when we have the labor, we are not really so certain that there will be sustainability. It's like continuity in the labor. So people are getting more concerned about the situation. So people are much more reluctant to work. So it's concerning. We have to look forward to finding solutions to it, of course, like I mentioned earlier. But the outlook saying looking forward was that we mentioned in the article that without proper planning, there's the risk of entire plants being closed temporarily. Building on the fact that we've already seen this happen to 2 pork plants in Quebec, a beef plant in Alberta, and a grocery store in Ontario. So many participants at the workshop that actually led to this report pointed out that when there are problems downstream, there are consequences for upstream sector, such as the case with culling of market-ready hogs as a result of plant closure. Again, this was the same issue I mentioned in the first part. But what is so interesting about this report, the report is saying that we need to put in place plans. We need to put in place business continuity plans that will help farmers recover from this situation. And I do think that it's an important thing to take out from this, because considering that there are all these challenges and a lot of uncertainties surrounding farmers and their work from now and going into the future, business continuity plans is actually something we should be looking into for most part, not just from the farmers, but of course the entire food supply chain. So, but we also need to, of course, have government and industry prepare together, sitting side by side, talking about collective solutions in order to help us go through what we are actually experiencing now. So that is going to be important. So moving away from that, I'm just kind of flagging the report. If you want to read more about it, you can probably search for it on the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute website. To kind of read more about this report and some of its outlook and the recommendations it actually has for the future. So the last article I'm going to touch on in this episode is an article by Alberta farmer. So it talks specifically about Alberta, but I do think that there are lessons that we could learn for the entire Canada and beyond, of course. So the article was run late in April, but I still think it's very important to talk about it. Say, ag industry, a potential bright spot post-pandemic. And the whole idea about the article is that since Alberta is going through some kind of struggle and most sectors are being shut down because of the pandemic, but agriculture is still operating for most parts, and we do know that it's entire Canada, even though most sectors are shut down, agriculture has been operating. So it actually has that foundation that we could actually use to build our economies going into the future. So that's the whole idea surrounding that article. I'm going to read a few lines from the article. Then, we'll talk about a few more things before we wrap up for this episode. So the Alberta ag sector will be key in rebuilding the province economy once the pandemic is over, says the Director of Research for Economics at ATB Financial. Overall, direct quotation, I think one of the bright spots in a really dark economic situation in the province is our agriculture and agri-food sector. Rob Roach said, it's still producing, it's still providing an essential service. It hasn't closed down in the way a lot of businesses have. So, like I mentioned earlier, because the agriculture sector has been functioning with, of course, not to full capacity, but comparing to other sectors, there is a foundation there. There is something that we can actually build on. So that's actually something we should look into. And I don't just think this article is relevant to Alberta. I do think that it is actually relevant to entire Canada. And the agriculture sector already has a lot of prospects for the Canadian economy. So it is time that we probably take this as an advantage. Like I mentioned earlier, it's providing us like a blank slate to build up from. It's a foundation. And since the sector has been operating, we have opportunity to take advantage of this and build the economy on the agriculture sector. There are a lot of prospects for employment, for economic growth, and all that we can actually think about. If we actually look into the agriculture sector, especially with this pandemic and the fact that this pandemic has actually taught us the value of the sector, from the temporary foreign worker on the farm to the grocery store worker who is standing there sacrificing to help us eat, have our meals. It tells us the value of each of these workers and, of course, the value of the entire industry. So it's important that we start to work. We have to get to work. I do think that like I mentioned, the government still need to do more for the agriculture sector. There is a lot of potential in the sector, and if we do not take advantage of this, I am sure in the next couple of years we are going to look back and regret that we actually missed an opportunity to build our economy based on agriculture, or to build our economy and build the agricultural sector as an integral part of it. So, like I said, today's episode, we've just gone through a few things, articles about some of the issues that have come out with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, by going through a few headlines of these issues within the Canadian agricultural landscape. So we've talked about the federal government support, we've talked about issues of the labor shortage, we've talked about problems in meat processing and then its implication for farmers. But then we've also highlighted some of the prospects that this pandemic has brought in terms of rediscovering the value of agriculture and building on it going into the future. So let's take advantage of that. So to just wrap up today's episode, I'm going to it's not an announcement, but I'm going to touch on something very important to we those who like agriculture, especially for Ontario. So what I just wanted to talk about is actually related to the Canada Outdoor Farm Show, which was scheduled to take place between September 15th to 17th. So the news that came out this week was that due to the challenges in terms of physical distancing. I like to use physical distance rather than social distancing. So due to challenges of physical distancing, the outdoor farm show has been cancelled. Not entirely, because there are plans to have a virtual outdoor farm show. So there are still plans in place, and those of us who are enthusiasts of the show and we're looking forward to it, all hopes are not lost. You should look out for the plans to be unveiled in the next couple of weeks or months about how it will actually look like in a virtual experience. I'm sure it's still going to be great, because the Canada Outdoor Farm Show has always been great. So we look forward to seeing how it will be, and let's all wait and see what the plans will be. We are running out of time, so thank you very much for joining us for this episode. We do hope that you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for sticking with Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. We will continue to bring you more exciting discussions, exciting news, and exciting issues with regards to food and agriculture in Gulf, in Ontario, in Canada, and beyond. And it is because of you, our listeners, that we continue to do this. I just want to use this again to iterate my thanks to you and to tell everybody to stay safe as we continue to weather the storm through these unprecedented times in our lives. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Thank you for listening to Food Farm Talk. See you next week for another exciting edition.